Assalamu alaikum, and welcome back once again to Today in African History with Baba Shaka. I'm Baba Shaka, and today is June 30th, 2021, and today is the final day in the self-proclaimed International African Scientists and Inventors Month. At least for this year. Now, before we get started, I would like to acknowledge what a great day today is. Some of you may have already heard the great news, but some of you may have not. You see, the Supreme Court of the state of Pennsylvania has ruled that the great comedian, philanthropist, and educator, Dr. William H. Cosby, otherwise known as Bill Cosby, is to be released immediately. According to the state Supreme Court, Dr. Cosby was denied a fair trial and has been unjustly imprisoned. Yes, folks, Bill is going home. The American injustice system is apparently trying to correct itself. Now, let's get back to the conclusion of our International African Scientists and Inventors Month. Now, you may have noticed that the overwhelming majority of scientists and inventors who we cover this month tended to be people who, despite their great work, were virtually unknown to most of us because of the propensity of the American miseducation system to deliberately whitewash the information taught to our children. But for this practice, there would be no need for a YouTube channel called Today in African History. Now, I originally thought that I would skip over some personalities whose names were somewhat more familiar. You know, Marcus Garvey, Martin Luther King, Malcolm X, so on and so forth. But there's one name that, even though it is familiar to many of us, I just couldn't end the month without mentioning him. Born on a farm near Diamond, Missouri, the exact date of his birth is unknown, but it's thought that he was born either in January or June of 1864. But 9 years prior, Moses Carver, a white farm owner, purchased George Carver's mother, Mary, when she was just 13 years old. The elder Carver reportedly was against slavery, but needed help with his 240-acre farm. At least that's the story. Now, when George was an infant, he, his mother, and his sister were kidnapped from the Carver farm by one of the bands of slave raiders who roamed Missouri during the Civil War era, and then they were sold in Kentucky. Moses Carver hired a neighbor to retrieve them, but the neighbor only succeeded in finding George, whom he purchased by trading one of Moses' finest horses. And young George grew up knowing little about his mother or his father, who had died in an accident before he was born. Moses Carver and his wife Susan raised the young George and his brother James as their own and taught the boys how to read and write. Now, James gave up his studies and focused on working the fields with Moses. George, however, was a frail and sickly child who could not help with such work. So instead, Susan taught him how to cook, mend, embroider, do laundry and garden, as well as how to concoct simple herbal medicines. At a young age, George took a keen interest in plants and experimented with natural pesticides, fungicides, and soil conditioners. He became known as the plant doctor to local farmers due to his ability to discern how to improve the health of their gardens, fields, and orchards. Now, at the age of 11, young George left the farm to attend an all-black school in the nearby town of Neosho. And he was taken in by Andrew and Mariah Watkins, a childless African couple who gave him a roof over his head in exchange for help with household chores and stuff like that. A midwife and nurse, Mariah imparted on young Carver her broad knowledge of medicinal herbs and her devout faith. Now, disappointed with the education he received at the Neosho school, young George moved to Kansas about 2 years later, joining numerous other Africans who were traveling west. And for the next decade or so, young Carver moved from one Midwestern town to another, putting himself through school and surviving off of the domestic skills he learned from his foster mothers. He graduated from Minneapolis High School in Minneapolis, Kansas in 1880 and applied to Highland College in Kansas. He was initially accepted at the all-white college, but was later rejected when the administration learned that he was African. Sounds familiar? Yes, indeed. Right. Now, in the late 1880s, Carver befriended the Milhollands, a white couple in Winterset, Iowa, who encouraged them to pursue a higher education. Despite his former setback, he enrolled in Simpson College, which was a Methodist school that admitted all qualified applicants. You qualified, you get in. You have to be black or white, right? Now, George Carver initially studied art and piano. Get that. He initially studied art and piano in hopes of earning a teaching degree, but one of his professors, Miss Etta Budd, was skeptical of a black man being able to make a living as an artist. So after learning of his interest in plants and flowers, Mrs. Budd encouraged young Carver to apply to the Iowa State Agricultural School, which is now known as Iowa State University, in order to study botany. In 1894, Mr. Carver became the first African to earn a Bachelor of Science degree. Impressed by Carver's research on the fungal infection of soybean plants, his professors asked him to stay on for graduate studies. I'm supposing that was a scholarship. Okay. Now, young Carver worked with famed fungal scientist L.H. Pamel at the Iowa State Experimental Station, honing his skills in identifying and treating plant diseases. In 1896, George Carver earned his Master of Agriculture degree and immediately received several offers, the most attractive of which came from none other than Booker T. Washington, whose last name George would later add to his own and become George Washington Carver. Of course, Booker T. Washington was the founder and president of Tuskegee Institute, which is now known as Tuskegee University in Alabama. Booker T. Washington convinced the university's trustees to establish an agricultural school which could only be run by Carver if Tuskegee was to keep its all-black faculty. Dr. Carver, I gave him that name. Dr. Carver accepted the offer and would work at Tuskegee Institute for the rest of his life. Now, Carver's early years at Tuskegee was not without hiccups. For one thing, agricultural training was not popular. Southern farmers believed they already knew how to farm, and students saw schooling as a means to escape farming. Additionally, many faculty members resented Professor Carver for his high salary and demand to have two, not one, but two dormitory rooms, one for him and one for plant specimens. You got to have a room for that, right? Professor Carver also struggled with the demands of the faculty position that he held. He wanted to devote his time to research in agriculture for ways to help out poor Southern farmers. But he was also expected to manage the school's two farms, teach, ensure the school's toilet and sanitary facilities work properly, and sit on multiple committees and councils. Professor Carver and Booker T. Washington had a complicated relationship and would butt heads often, in part because Professor Carver wanted little to do with teaching, though he was beloved by his students. Professor Carver would eventually get his way when Booker T. Washington died in 1915 and was succeeded by Robert Russell Moulton, who relieved the professor of his teaching duties except for summer school. By this time, though, Professor Carver already had great successes in the laboratory and the community. He taught poor farmers that they could feed hog acorns instead of commercial feed and enrich croplands with swamp muck instead of fertilizers. His idea of crop rotation proved to be most valuable. Through his work on soil chemistry, Professor Carver learned that years of growing cotton had depleted the nutrients from soil, resulting in low yields. But by growing nitrogen-fixing plants like peanuts, soybeans, and sweet potatoes, the soil could be restored, allowing yield to increase dramatically when the land was reverted to cotton use a few years later. To further help farmers, he invented what is called the Jessup wagon, which was a kind of a mobile horse-drawn classroom and laboratory used to demonstrate soil chemistry. Farmers, of course, loved the high yields of cotton they were now getting from Carver's crop rotation technique, but the method had unintended consequences: a surplus of peanuts and other non-cotton products. So Professor Carver set to work on finding alternative uses for these products. For example, he invented numerous products from sweet potato, including edible products like flour and vinegar, and non-food items such as stains, dyes, paints, and writing ink. But Professor Carver's biggest success came from and you know it, peanuts. In all, he developed more than 300 food, industrial, and commercial products from peanuts, including milk, Worcester sauce, punches, cooking oil and salad oil, paper, cosmetics, soap, and wood stains. He also experimented with peanut-based medicines such as antiseptics, laxatives, and goiter medications. It should be noted, however, that many of these suggestions or discoveries remained curiosities and did not find widespread application, but he did it nevertheless. Now, in 1921, Professor Carver appeared before the Ways and Means Committee of the U.S. House of Representatives on behalf of the peanut industry, which at that time was seeking tariff protection. Though his testimony did not begin well, he described the wide range of products that could be made from peanuts, which not only earned him a standing ovation, but also convinced the committee to approve a high protective tariff for the common legume. He then became known as the Peanut Man. Yeah, the Peanut Man. Now, in the last 2 decades of his life, George Carver lived as a minor celebrity, but his focus was always on helping people. He traveled the South to promote racial harmony, and he traveled to India to discuss nutrition in developing nations with, you guessed it, Mahatma Gandhi. Now, up until the year of his death, he also released bulletins for the public. Actually, he released 44 bulletins between 1898 and 1943. Some of the bulletins reported on research findings, but many others were more practical in nature and included cultivation information for farmers, science for teachers, and recipes for housewives. In the mid-1930s, when the polio virus raged in America, Professor Carver became convinced that peanuts were the answer. He offered a treatment of peanut oil massages and reported positive results, though no scientific evidence exists that the treatments worked. Probably the benefits patients experienced were likely due to the massage treatments and attentive care rather than to the oil, but I don't know. So you go try it and you let me know. Now, George Washington Carver joined the ancestors on January 5th, 1943 at Tuskegee Institute after falling down the stairs of his home. He was 78 years old, and Professor Carver is buried next to Booker T. Washington on the Tuskegee Institute ground. Now, soon after this, President Franklin D. Roosevelt signed legislation for Professor Carver to receive his own monument, an honor previously only granted to Presidents George Washington and Abraham Lincoln. Right? So he got a monument even before some other presidents. The George Washington Carver National Monument now stands in Diamond, Missouri. Professor Carver was also posthumously inducted into the National Inventors Hall of Fame. Yes, indeed. Couldn't skip him. Had to finish with him. So, well, folks, we have come to the conclusion of our International African Scientists and Inventors Month. I truly hope that you have gotten something out of these lessons. I also hope that we are successful in piquing your interest in these great scientists and inventors, and that you are encouraged to dig deeper into the subject matter. So again, congratulations to Dr. Cosby on his much overdue release today. And a great big thank you to all of our subscribers. To those of you who have not yet subscribed, please take a second and hit that subscribe button below the screen and bless us with your much needed support. Please like and leave a comment down in the comment section below. But most importantly, let me repeat this again, most importantly, please share, especially with the young amongst us, because as you and I both know, this material is not taught in our schools. So, until tomorrow, inshallah, this is Baba Shaka with Today in African History. Masalam.